We're standing right at the precipice of the modern era. You see, the First World War didn't just redraw the map of Europe, it fundamentally and irrevocably transformed the United States. Over the span of just a few short years, America completely flipped the script. It transitioned from a debtor nation, one that actually relied on foreign capital to fuel its own expansion, into the undisputed economic and ideological superpower of the globe. In this explainer, we're going to dive into this breathtaking shift from profound promise to harsh reality. Understanding this exact transition after World War I is absolutely crucial because it literally laid the very foundation for America's role in the world today. We're going to explore the ambition, the economic explosion, and of course the bitter domestic hangover that followed the so-called war to end all wars.
At the war's bitter end, the global expectations placed on America were, well, almost messianic. The sheer scale of moral authority and prestige the United States held was completely unprecedented in human history. Just listen to these words from a young Croatian in 1919. Like Jesus Christ, President Wilson brings good news to the small and the weak. The ordinary masses believe in Wilson. They see him as their chief ally and greatest hope. I mean, to compare an American president to a divine savior, that really reveals the deep, desperate yearning of a shattered world. The masses truly believed America was their ultimate salvation and their absolute greatest hope for lasting equality.
Section 1. The New Global Creditor. So how exactly did America gain that immense moral and political leverage on the world stage? Well, first we have to look at the massive shift in global wealth.
Before 1917, the United States was still building itself up, borrowing heavily from European powers to finance its own rapid industrial and territorial growth. But the Great War completely inverted that dynamic. As European empires drained their treasuries in the mud of the trenches, the U.S. became their lifeline. It transformed into a massive global creditor, issuing loans worth billions of dollars to allied nations. And this wasn't just to fight the war, but to completely rebuild their devastated infrastructures afterward. This created a profound structural shift. The entire New World economy became this highly precarious web of debt, one that was entirely dependent on American financial resources just to stay afloat.
Section 2. Forging the war machine. Now, it's important to remember that this staggering economic dominance certainly didn't happen overnight, and it definitely didn't happen organically.
Honestly, early American neutrality was pretty confused, disorganized, and deeply inefficient. To actually project power across the Atlantic, the federal government had to step in with aggressive, unprecedented authority, essentially mobilizing the entirety of American society. Think about it. Building and equipping a mass army meant the state had to reach deeply into everyday civilian life. They launched Liberty loans to aggressively vacuum up public funds for the war effort. The War Industries Board stepped in to dictate private industrial production. The Food and Fuel Act rigorously rationed basic resources right on the home front. Taxes skyrocketed under the War Revenue Act to fund explosive federal spending. The government even took the extreme step of nationalizing the railroads just to ensure the seamless transportation of troops and wartime goods. It was total state mobilization. It started as a slow, uncertain process, but it ultimately forged a terrifyingly efficient American war machine.
And the result of all this sweeping government intervention? It was nothing short of an economic explosion. The numbers here are just staggering. Back in 1916, the U.S. gross national product sat at $46 billion. By 1920, even after the guns had fallen silent, it had skyrocketed to over $87 billion. The American economy had been transformed into an unstoppable, powerful beast. Exports surged to unprecedented levels. The steel industry roared into overdrive to meet endless demand, and the nation achieved nearly full employment. The war hadn't broken America, it had totally supercharged it.
Section 3. Wilson's Grand Vision. Armed with this untouched, booming economy and the perception of having moral purity or clean hands, President Woodrow Wilson saw a really unique historical window.
Now, Wilson was a complex figure, a Southerner, a strict Calvinist, a progressive, and an academic. He firmly believed that the secret alliances, the closed-door treaties, and the relentless imperialism of the old European powers were the definitive root causes of the war. His solution? A philosophy that came to be known as Wilsonian idealism, which he most famously outlined in his 14 points. He wanted to entirely dismantle the old imperial system, replacing it with the unalienable right to self-determination for all peoples. In his vision, future peace wouldn't be maintained by a massive balance of national armies, but by collective security and transparent international agreements. The absolute cornerstone of this vision was the League of Nations, an international body designed specifically to ensure this would truly be the war to end all wars.
But right across the globe, a completely different, radical vision was simultaneously taking root. A fierce ideological rivalry was born in the ashes of the conflict. while Wilson was championing a world of independent democracies anchored by free trade and global regulation. Over in Russia, Vladimir Lenin was preaching a totally different gospel. Ironically enough, both men completely agreed that imperialism had caused the global slaughter. But while Wilson's foreign policy offered a path of liberal global governance, Lenin's solution was the total overthrow of the capitalist system through world socialism. The ideological battle lines of the 20th century were already being drawn right then and there.
Section 4. The Peace Conference. Of course, taking that shining, pristine example of Republican democracy to the January 1919 Paris Peace Conference meant confronting the incredibly messy, cynical realities of global politics.
Wilson quickly discovered just how exceptionally difficult it is to convert lofty academic ideals into geopolitical reality. He faced fierce, exhausting clashes of opinion with the other members of the so-called Big Four peacemakers, Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. These European leaders represented nations that had literally been bled white by years of catastrophic trench warfare. They weren't looking for idealism, they were seeking hard security, territorial buffers, and punishing financial reparations from Germany. Those priorities made Wilson's pure, forgiving idealism nearly impossible to actually implement at the negotiating table.
So the final outcomes forged in Paris ended up being deeply compromised. The peacemakers didn't completely fail, right? They successfully negotiated 5 separate treaties, they fundamentally redrew the map of Europe by founding new nations, and they did finally establish the League of Nations. But the cost was steep and the compromises were incredibly painful. Wilson's grand promises of self-determination were selectively applied. For instance, strong opposition from other global powers completely blocked independence for the Armenian and Kurdish peoples, leaving them stateless. By the end of the conference, all that lofty rhetoric had faded, leaving behind a profound and widespread disillusionment among both the triumphant winners and the devastated losers of the Great War.
Section 5. The Post-War Hangover. And that creeping disillusionment, it wasn't just felt abroad on the European continent. Wilson returned home to an exhausted country facing a harsh, violent adjustment back to peacetime conditions.
50,000. That is the number of American soldiers killed in action. Now, while this figure was relatively small compared to the millions of casualties suffered by France, Britain, or Germany, the shock to the American psyche was immense. It was more than enough blood spilled to deeply sway the public. A fierce political backlash took hold, turning opinion sharply against participating any further in what many Americans increasingly viewed as simply Europe's war.
And compounding the profound tragedy of those lost on the battlefield was an invisible enemy that returned home with the troops. The terrible Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919. This devastating virus ravaged the nation with terrifying speed, claiming even more American lives than the muddy trenches of Europe. The mass death and panic deeply unsettled the country, forcing widespread quarantines, disrupting daily life, and drastically worsening the already fraying social divisions across the United States. At the very same time, that mighty wartime economic engine we talked about was abruptly thrown into reverse. The structural shock to the system was massive and immediate. Federal government spending plummeted from a wartime peak of $15 billion all the way down to under $6 billion in just a couple of years. The armed forces were rapidly dismantled, shrinking from 2.9 million personnel in 1918 down to a mere 400,000 by 1920. Imagine millions of men suddenly returning home, looking for jobs right as industrial production was grinding to a halt. The nation was entirely unprepared for the sheer velocity of this economic contraction.
This demobilization was basically a cascading failure. By 1919, this sudden halt in war production sparked intense labor strikes and deep ethnic and social fractures across American cities. As 1920 arrived, the crucial wartime trade with Europe virtually stopped. American banks, really feeling the pressure, began aggressively calling in those massive wartime loans, while unchecked inflation just continued to sting the average consumer. This perfect storm of domestic instability culminated in a sharp, painful, and persistent economic recession by 1921.
So, with the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires utterly destroyed, and with Britain and France pushed to the very edge of bankruptcy, the United States had emerged from the rubble as the undisputed global economic giant. But, considering the bitter domestic hangover, the violent social divisions, and America's ultimate refusal to join the League of Nations, we have to ask a profound question. Can a nation build the modern world only to immediately turn its back on it? It's a question that really challenges us to consider how this brief and tense era of American intervention, followed by a swift retreat into isolationism, fundamentally set the stage for the rest of the 20th century.